environment, right? Keep the straight face, don't show any emotion. Maybe some
Yeah.
people's families are like that, right? Some people have that, maybe we're taught that in school in various places. So the denial of feelings, that cultural, I think, way of being is very common, and it shows up in so many ways that we don't realize, I think. And so I'm glad we're talking about this today with feelings and I'll take it back to what we talked about at the beginning about why we're here and why we do these conversations, right? We do you and I have these conversations to bring this knowledge to people who are ready to hear it. We have it to, I think, explain this in a different way. So if people want to start participating in life, the things that we talk about here are how you do that.
Right. So this last part that you said is to me of cardinal importance, that you apply this knowledge to the way that you conduct your life.
Right.
So your actions, conducting your life is the action of your life, so that all of your relationships and so on are infused then with the richness of that knowledge. Because otherwise we are living in a very superficial way.
Right. And I know I've talked about on here my experience with experiencing it in our conversation and knowing it is that feeling in my body when I feel the loosening, or I feel my stomach unclenched that I really didn't even know that it was clenched. And as I go away from our conversations and I think about this in my life, it starts to change the things that you do. You do things differently when you start looking at life this way. And that is how change happens, right? We don't continue on the same path that we are and expect for change. We have to do something different. We have to look at us, whatever it is, a different action has to be taken. And so the things that we talk about here, and I think what we stress and what we encourage for everybody listening is to start applying this in your own life and see how that changes. See what that does to you.
See, I see this as consciously involving yourself in your own evolution.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So evolution is not a passive thing that we just, to some degree, it happens to us whether we agree to it or not. But the evolution that we're talking about as human beings, we're capable of consciously engaging and involving ourselves in our evolution.
Right.
And we've got something. Then we are fulfilling the reason for being human.
Right.
Because a cabbage head can't do that, And a lot of humans live like as if they had a cabbage head above their shoulders.
That they do.
And in their chest.
That they do. And it's amazing to me that people do. But again, why we're doing this is to encourage participation. And so I want to move into what I wanted to everything. Our conversations always go so many directions, which is why I love talking to you. But there was a pearl of wisdom that you sent out last week, I think. And if for the listeners who aren't aware, Erhard sends out a pearl of wisdom every week, and it's usually a very short but very succinct statement that has so much packed into each word. And I like having conversations about those because they're so again, another way to experience to know. So this one was, they run away from the light and mistake the ensuing shadow as their identity. So this kind of goes along with what we've been talking about with experiencing ourselves, but maybe we could start in that statement. What does light and shadow mean in that statement?
Well, I guess you could say light is the conscious experience of being, and shadow is to be in the darkness of ignorance regarding yourself.
Right.
And, try sometimes to ask your friends to define their being, their real identity, and you'll get weird answers. You'll get, amongst the most prevalent answer is usually, are you okay? Why are you asking such a question?
Why are you asking me that? Right, exactly.
Well, it's the most important question, because how can you conduct your life for you, because isn't your life supposed to be for you, right?
Yes. Yes.
Oh no, that's selfish, people will say. That's the excuse usually. So what you're presenting then to yourself is to other people in your lack of selfishness is you're presenting somebody who you're not.
Right.
Because
Right.
if you're not in touch with who you really are, you cannot relate to somebody in that ignorance as the real you.
Right. And like you were mentioning, the person who had denied their own feelings and was at a point where they thought they couldn't feel anything, if denying our own selves, our own light, I I know I've been through this. And again, it's a process, but I think many people also don't know the real version of themselves. They don't know who they really are. There's so many masks and so many layers on, trying to, show up in certain ways as they feel like people expect them to. And so when we start to peel those off and instead of moving away from it, start moving towards it and wake up to who we really are. That movement towards that, because there is that, I guess, if you haven't done it, if you've been in your own shadow and it can feel scary, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel all of these things. But as we mentioned, change is
can you just insert something here?
Yes.
The fear is not due to the light, it's due to being in the darkness.
Right. Yes.
But
yes.
we think that we get afraid when the lights get turned on.
Right. Yes. And that movement, I guess what I've noticed in my own life is we want to change, let's say, any sort of change, but we don't want to do what's required of the change. And it's required for the change. We have to do different. We have to, like we were talking about, take different actions, there has to be something different. And
wanting it is not enough.
Right.
You got to respond to that want, but like we have an open house every 2 months or so, and I usually end up saying, after I've talked to them for the evening,
mm-hmm.
I usually end up saying, may you value yourself sufficiently to do something about this, to find out who you really are, because the grand majority of people don't know who they really are.
No, and that was in my notes. That was actually what I was going to bring up next, because that was one of the key, when we first started talking, that was one of the key statements that you said that woke me up to how I wanted to experience myself. And it's one of those statements that gets you at your own attention, because I think most of us will think, well, of course I value myself sufficiently. But if you look at your actions, if you look at what you're doing, if you look at, are you living the same day over and over and over again, saying you want something to change, but nothing is changing, right? Like you said, you have to want it, and to want it,
you have to do it.
Right. And yet there has to be an action involved. And we talked even last month about the title of the podcast, Create What You Speak. You and I, our conversation last month was about that, about what that means, but then also that action portion of that, right? Putting it into action. Yeah. And I think when we need to start paying attention to those kinds of questions that we're asking ourselves, not just saying, yes, I do value myself, when we're having some interaction or we're listening to something like this, but then you go off and 99% of your time you live your life in the opposite of that.
Right. So wishing and wanting and is not enough, because if you don't take action, it's just fantasizing.
Right.
And fantasies are not reality.
Right.
That's why they're called fantasies.
Right.
Yes,
and that movement towards the light, movement towards that true version of ourselves. Yes.
Consciously experiencing. It's kind of redundant, because it's just saying being conscious.
Yes.
But the root of consciousness is to be in the experience of you being. right?
Yes.
Because if you're not experiencing that you're being, then the root of consciousness is missing, and you can be experiencing the weather and the words and all the circumstances and conditions, but if you're not relating it to an awareness of being, then that stuff is just out there.
Right.
Your
And
experiences are just out there.
yes. And so bringing that back in, that I think all of our conversations so far have been, I mean, it hasn't been said in this way of, you know, moving towards the light, but that's the purpose. That is what we've been talking about on
Yeah.
pretty much every episode that we've talked about. And that shadow that I think maybe most people are so used to, being in that ignorance of themselves as maybe a form of protection, or maybe maybe just they don't know, right? Or maybe they just have never heard it. Who knows? There's many reasons, but that moving towards the light, that consciously experiencing ourselves is I feel like, at least for myself, and I think if people are listening to the show, they're probably feeling the same. Like, I'm at a point that I can't not do that anymore. I can't live in that shadow. I can't live in that ignorance of myself. I will not tolerate it for myself.
Right.
And when you take that stance for yourself, when you make, it's like you put the stake in the ground and say, I'm not living in that shadow anymore. I'm not doing it. I am moving towards my light, my conscious experience. It felt for me, and I made that decision a while ago, and it's still an ongoing process, obviously, but it felt to me that making that decision and calling that and claiming it helped some of that fear fall away. It helped it didn't feel as like it didn't, the shadow didn't feel it had the power over me like it maybe had previously. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. In fact, I would say, when you're successful with the pursuit of real experience that brings real knowledge, the shadow becomes eliminated.
Yeah.
You don't have to work on that for the rest of your life. You can stand up and be decisive and say, okay, I'm going to find out who I am, and that's not difficult.
Right.
Like with my program, people they are secure that they know who they are, and it's not just wishful thinking. They know who they are. Then it's just a matter of enacting it, putting it into action, living it.
Right.
Having that be the foundation of all of your experience has to be consciousness. Consciousness is the awareness of the being that you are, not the awareness of a false idea regarding yourself.
Right. Right.
And the thing is, even when you begin working on this, and it's not something that happens automatically. It doesn't happen even through a lot of experience unless you direct the experience and focus the experience according to you.
Right.
Circumstances and conditions will not do that. Sometimes a very intensive experience may shake you up, and usually people then discover, God, I better do something about myself, right? And they
hit rock bottom, and
they make their New Year's resolution in July, if it happens in July,
right.
But then they don't follow through, but you need to follow. If you do follow through, that's where the joy of life comes in.
Yeah.
That's where you feel that you're a creative participant in your life now.
Yes.
And you become rock solid secure. Because once you have the experience of self, the real self that you are, I write it with a capital S, not the little ego self.
Right.
Once you're in touch with that, you're absolutely secure, no matter what the circumstances are that will come to me. I will always have that. I have the security of being in the knowledge and the conscious experience of myself every moment. So even if something either tragic or painful or so happens, I have that.
Right.
And And it doesn't mean I deny what happens out